and indication to that right now. And now I'll introduce our speakers. Alejandro Butela is an independent research scholar and non-resident fellow of the Center for Global Policy who focuses on the study of nonviolent and violent far-right extremist and Islamist movements. He's a former senior research analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center and a former researcher with START. Daryl Johnson is also a non-resident fellow of the Center for Global Policy and one of the foremost experts on domestic extremist groups in the US. Beginning his career as a civilian in the US Army, Johnson has held a number of government positions, most recently as senior analyst at the Department of Homeland Security. Alejandro, I'm going to share my screen and then you can take it away.
Excellent, thank you very much. And can everyone hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
Great, great. Erin, again, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to START and the University of Maryland for hosting today's discussion here, as well as the support from the Center for Global Policy for making our publication possible. And with that, I want to just briefly note here that, as Erin had mentioned earlier, Daryl and I are non-resident fellows at the Center for Global Policy, which is basically a think tank located in Washington, D.C., and is focused on the intersection of US policy and Muslim geopolitics. Daryl and I are going to be heading a year-long project that's looking at the current dynamics and trends of the far right in both Europe as well as North America, but with obviously a particular focus on the United States. And before we sort of get into the meat of today's presentation and discussion, just a quick word, I think, about CGP's mission and the wider context of the publication and the project itself. Because when someone thinks of a mission like CGP, well, where does the far right then sort of come into all of that? And some people may immediately come to mind of the tragedy that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, with the terrorist attack there, as well as the Poway, California synagogue shooting, in which there was also, prior to that terrorist attack, also an arson attack against a mosque in the same area. But beyond some of those rather very, very extreme cases, organized anti-Muslim prejudice, or what's somewhat often referred to as Islamophobia, often has served as a useful issue to mobilize and recruit would-be supporters, particularly by actors on the far right. And in addition to that, it also serves a second important function, which is that it can act as a meeting point for otherwise often disparate and conflicting elements of the far right itself. And it gives them something to sort of coalesce around. And one illustrative example that I would point to would be an anti-Muslim protest that took place here in the United States in New York City in May 2017. And sort of what made this event rather significant was that the lead organizer of that particular event had openly identifies herself as Jewish. And while there were several high-profile members of the anti-Muslim movement of various backgrounds, you also had two other key players that were also present at that very protest, representing other far-right movement actors. There were a number of people who I identified as part of the 3%er movement, which is in the anti-government extremist sector of the far right. And then you also have, you had Mike Painovich, who had shown up there. And he is a well-known alt-right figure and neo-Nazi. And so to have sort of these various and often conflicting elements come together, I think, is sort of illustrative then as to why that's so important. And that, if we could imagine then the phenomenon as a funnel here for a moment, and where Daryl and I and this project fit in, what I just described to you is sort of the outer rim of the funnel. And now what we're going to do in today's presentation is sort of dive in a little bit deeper and a little more narrowly focused, looking at some of the more recent issues and the current socio-political context in which we were observing the recent surge in far-right mobilization. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Daryl. Can we go to the next slide, please? That's just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. And then the slide after that. Great. Daryl, I'll let you take it from there, please.
Yeah, so much like 2008, when we saw the unprecedented election of the first African-American president and the economic collapse related to the housing bubble, we have three major shocks that are playing into another rise in far-right recruitment and radicalization. These three major shocks are the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the economic downturn associated with that pandemic, and then lastly, these anti-racism civil unrest that's resulted from the George Floyd killing. So as of today, we have over 180,000 people currently dead from COVID-19. Governors and health organizations have issued mandates for self-isolation, social distancing, wearing of masks. These types of government regulations have really fueled a lot of the growth that we've seen in the past several months in these anti-government groups as well as hate groups. And so much like I told you, we had these factors that led up to the previous rise of right-wing extremism. We have these three major shock waves that have created a new rise. Alejandro?
Great. And if we could go to the next slide then. And so amid that backdrop then, there's, especially with the anti-racism protests that were most recently catalyzed by the death of George Floyd, there have been a number of elected officials, news media reporting, and other commentators sort of highlighting this concern about outsider actor presence at protests. And they'll describe, for instance, Antifa or anti-fascists on the far left, or quote unquote white supremacists on the far right. And what Daryl and I have noticed is that the discourse, the public discussion on this has been sort of characterized by one of two sort of approaches to this. One of which I would call is anecdotal. Often that there are these very broad-reaching and sometimes overreaching claims that there are far right or far left actors that are in some way substantially and significantly behind and influencing otherwise overwhelmingly peaceful protests, and that they are the ones chiefly responsible for whatever extant violence has been associated with them. And sort of in response to these anecdotes and to a lot of these broad claims, has been that, for instance, we've noticed that there have been a number of local, regional, and national news media outlets, ranging from newspapers in, say, Texas or Washington State, all the way to Reuters and the New York Times, that critically examine and sift through existing arrest data surrounding any criminal activity that's been associated with these otherwise overwhelmingly peaceful protests. And what this sort of is an attempt to do is to sort of respond to and critically examine these otherwise anecdotally based claims. The issue with that approach to it, however, is that extant arrest data has its own limitations. What it can tell us is who was caught allegedly committing a crime at a certain time, but it doesn't necessarily, but it raises the possibility that there might have been other unlawful actors who haven't yet been caught. The other sort of limitation that's also important to keep in mind is that it doesn't necessarily tell us about any far left or far right actors who may have also been present in and around these protests, but not necessarily engaged in any unlawful conduct. And here I just want to take a pause and emphasize here for a moment that it's important for us, as social scientists, as analysts and observers here, to always remember to distinguish between what might be broadly termed as criminal, unlawful behaviors on the one hand and lawful behaviors on the other hand. And while the overwhelming majority of protesters themselves probably identify as neither far left or far right, and are exercising their First Amendment rights to assembly and speech, extremists who might have also been present in and around those protests and weren't engaged in any lawful conduct, in many ways were also exercising their First Amendment rights too. And so as a result of that, then we have to keep in mind that there are going to be limitations then as to the size, the scope, the nature of whatever far left, far right activity is in and around these protests at that time. And as a result of that, then what we felt is that in order for us to have a better analysis and forecasting and recommendations, then we felt like we needed to provide ourselves with at least some sort of attempt towards systematic data that's there. Next slide, please. So let me just quickly get into our data set here, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Daryl. First, let me say that our data set here is looking at both the far left and the far right. And this is, goes to the core of the mission of CGP itself, which is that we are attempting to examine this issue, and in this case, collect data in a systematic and non-partisan fashion. And therefore, we're looking at this in terms of both the far right and the far left. We do want to acknowledge and recognize, for instance, that there have been other organizations out there that have looked at the far right. Our data set is a little bit different. We've come to different numbers based on our own methods that are there. What I think is, in addition to our own, our value added is, in addition to our own approach to the far right, as far as we're aware, we're also the only ones that have attempted to systematically monitor and look at the far left. One thing I will say is that our attempt at a systematic approach to information collection has its own limitations as well. Our sources for the data set are going to be mainstream and reputable news outlets. To the extent that we may have relied on any freelance or independent news sources, we judge them strictly on a case-by-case basis. We also took information from social media accounts, but again, we had to examine those extremely closely. And of course, we examined reporting from watchdog groups, Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League, and the Institute for Education and Reporting on Human Rights. That all said is, of course, again, I have to emphasize our limitations to this. We collected open source data, so it's open source, number one, and data from May 26th, which is the day after George Floyd's death, all the way to June 20th, which is the day after June 19th, or the Juneteenth commemoration, which has extremely symbolic value to anti-racism efforts, and particularly in our current socio-political context. It's also important to emphasize that we are generally unable to identify or determine with any substantial confidence the size of far left or far right actor presence at protests. We can tell you that there were actors there who we can judge with significant confidence are either far left or far right. How many were there is much more difficult for us to tell. What we can sort of broadly say is that we believe that there were probably in small numbers, but even that varies from case to case. So while they might have been generally in small numbers, an exception to that might have been in Bethel, Ohio, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but where it seems like counter protesters who were mobilized by a significant far right narrative had substantially outnumbered anti-racism protesters that were there. Just a few other quick things in terms of limitations. You know, there are ongoing law enforcement investigations as well. So I mentioned before limitations to arrest data. We know that there are over 300 domestic terrorism investigations that federal law enforcement officials have said that have arisen as coinciding with the anti-racism protests. We are still awaiting the outcomes of those investigations and any sort of pending legal action. And then finally, you know, when we're looking at these sources themselves, there's also a bit of a observability and identification challenge as well. So for instance, if we're looking at a social media video where people are masked and often dressed in dark or black clothing, does that mean that they might be Black Bloc protesters associated with anarchism or using Black Bloc tactics? Or are they just simply criminal opportunists who are trying to hide themselves from and evading detection? It's unclear. There are also, I think, at least what we can say are anecdotal examples of where there are actors who are deliberately trying to misidentify themselves. The most significant case that we can think of at the moment would be the so-called Umbrella Man, who was masked, wearing an umbrella and just randomly smashing a property against the wishes of protesters that were there. There was speculation initially that either that individual was a criminal opportunist or possibly a far left actor. But subsequent information that's come out from a criminal investigation has in fact indicated that said individual is a white supremacist involved with the motorcycle gang, the Aryan Cowboys. So these are just challenges, limitations, constraints upon what we can and can't say with our data that's there, just to be clear moving forward. Daryl, I'll hand it back over to you.
All right, next slide. So on the far left, we're talking about three major extremist movements. We're talking about the violent anarchists, Black Bloc types. We also have violent Black nationalists, and then the anti-fascists or Antifa. Both the far left and the far right, we believe, are using the civil unrest for recruitment opportunities, pushing their extremist causes, radicalization as well. So the far left is mostly historically been characterized by attacks against property and violence directed at law enforcement personnel. They typically don't go after civilians. There may be rare cases where that's happened. The key narratives that the far left is pushing is social injustice, racism in policing, defunding the police, abolishing police agencies. These are just some of the agendas that are being pushed by far left. Their attacks in this recent few months that we've had of civil unrest has included everything from arson, both buildings and police vehicles, vandalism, sabotage incidents, throwing of all kinds of projectiles, fireworks being launched and thrown at the police, as well as fistfights and bodily weapons such as knives and things like this. And so, you know, this rhetoric and behavior that's being emanated by both the far right and far left is mobilizing people and causing them to join these causes as well as participate in both nonviolent and violent action. So, you know, we've seen this dynamic play out a little bit prior to the civil unrest with, you know, these pro-Trump rallies, things like this, where we've had these street brawls that have erupted between these two opposing extremist groups. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the forecasting, how we've seen a recent rise in that and how, you know, most likely that's going to escalate. Alejandro?
Yeah, Daryl, let me just add one quick note here in terms of the narratives on the far left. And this is something important to point out here is that essentially what we often are seeing here is that these are narratives and concerns that are shared by millions of other Americans, including the ones that were involved in the protests. What's significant about us raising this point, though, and we're going to see this on the far right as well, is that what they're trying to do is to attach themselves to issues of the moment, to heighten their profile and demonstrate their relevance and added value in order to insert themselves into the mainstream further that's there. So just so this way so people understand the tactics and strategies that these elements are using there, it's important to point that out, because this is sort of the modus operandi that we're noticing, especially at this particular socio-political juncture.
And next slide, please. So this is just a numerical breakdown of some of the events that we noted. So we've seen a far left presence at these anti-racism protests at 42 unique locations in 21 states, including the District of Columbia. We identified 28 locations where the violent anarchist / black bloc types have been present. We had 8 unique locations where the Antifa affiliates have been present, and 7 unique locations where we've had the extreme black nationalists. Next slide. So this is a graphic depiction throughout the country of where these far left extremists have been present at the protests from late May till late June. Next slide. So Alejandro had mentioned that we're aware of at least 300 domestic terrorism investigations currently being worked by the Department of Justice since the civil unrest has started. And these are just a few arrests that have resulted from preliminary investigations involving far left extremists. We had the May 31st looting and arson that resulted in $20,000 worth of damage at a Target department store in Austin. We had a June 1st attempt to Molotov cocktail, arson against the police by an anarchist individual that had some Molotov cocktails. We also had an individual that's affiliated with the anarchist movement in Pittsburgh conduct a vandalism of a police vehicle and also incite a riot on June the 5th. So these are just some of the examples of some of the far left violence that we've been able to identify through open source. Next slide. All right, just to kind of begin the discussion about the far right activities during these protests, we focused on 2 main movements, namely the white supremacy movement and anti-government extremists. There's multiple sub-movements within these 2 broader umbrella movements. So that's how we generally categorize them. Multiple ideologies. Just for example, under white supremacy, you could have anybody from the KKK to neo-Nazis to Aryan gangs, things of this nature. On the anti-government side, there could be sovereign citizens, militia extremists, and just others who are just generally anti-government on the far right. And so the ideologically motivated attacks that we've seen from these movements historically and even currently have focused largely on attacking people rather than property, whether it's law enforcement personnel, immigrants, people of various faiths. So that's kind of the big distinction between what we've seen between far right and far left extremists as far as how they conduct their violent attacks. One other thing that I'll just mention anecdotally that I'm concerned about is we've seen this far right movement continually grow, recruit, conduct violent attacks for the past 10 years at least. But it's been pretty much absent of far left violence. We had a micro trend of black nationalists killing police officers back in 2016. We had some isolated incidents where a leftist individual shot up a Republican baseball game, things like this. But what I'm really concerned about with this recent civil unrest is the amount of violence that we're seeing as far as arson attacks and property destruction. And this could mark the beginning of a new trend of far left violence. So that's something that we're going to have to continue to monitor. Alejandro?
Great, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, perhaps in the forecasting towards the end. Thank you, Daryl. Next slide. Great. So, one thing, that we want the audience here to also be presented with here is that in observing the mobilization of far-right actors amid the anti-racism protests that's been taking place, there have been two key narratives with respect to the two key sort of movements, far-right movements that have been mobilized at this current juncture. So on the one hand, we have white supremacists. There's been a heightened talk about race war going on at the moment, particularly from a subset of white supremacists who call themselves accelerationists, people who basically want to instigate a race war itself. And then on the other hand, you have the civil war, which closely parallels a race war itself in many respects, but is less overtly racist. This is an idea that's mostly espoused by anti-government extremists. You hear this a lot, especially within sort of the so-called Boogaloo sub-movement, within the sort of broader anti-government extremist milieu. And the two narratives in many ways parallel each other. Race war itself, the most commonly cited enemies, and I'm not going to be reading verbatim what's up here, but just to sort of give the overview, we're talking about African Americans, Jews, Latinx, race traitor whites, and Muslims. For anti-government extremists, they're not going to be typically as overt in the naming of their target selection, but what they will mention is, for instance, Black Lives Matter, as opposed to Black people writ large, or George Soros and the Federal Reserve rather than Jews, and sort of playing on anti-Semitic tropes about Jews and money and finance, or illegals rather than Latinx individuals. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion related to Antifa or socialists, which might be thought of as a proxy for so-called race traitor whites and Jews. One of the notable exceptions to sort of this coded dog whistle, if you will, rhetoric might be Muslims, who are just typically, just like in white supremacist circles for many anti-government extremists, they have also, as of late, incorporated very explicit, overt anti-Muslim prejudice into their narratives, into their rhetoric, and even at times into their target set for armed protests and violence. And of course, these narratives themselves, which are associated with the mobilization of these far-right actors, they're expressed in a number of different ways. I don't need to repeat what's already up on the screen, but this is sort of the rhetoric and the storytelling, if you will, that's sort of being associated with a lot of the action that we're seeing on the ground from these respective actor movements. Next slide, please. So when we looked at and collected our data, and then we finally got around to analyzing it, we identified that there were sort of four different categories of activity surrounding the far right and the recent anti-racism protests. There's attempted ideologically motivated violence, or what some people in a more shorthand form would call terrorism. There's the nonviolent but visible presence in and around protests. Often, this may be the Boogaloo movement, wearing Hawaiian shirts and in armed tactical gear, or white supremacists who may also show up and engage in counter protests that are there. Or in the case of a particular subset of the alt-right, the Groypers, they did a lot of video bombing of TV interviews. That was particularly notable. The third type of activity we also found were disinformation efforts. That's going to be especially important with one particular category of data that I'm going to describe shortly. But essentially, there were rumors that were virally spread across social media platforms alleging that Antifa and Black Lives Matter were going to be coming to quote unquote white neighborhoods and engaging in rioting and looting. As a result of that, a moral panic ensued in a number of communities. Some had contacted the local elected officials and law enforcement to determine whether or not these rumors were true, but others had actually formed their own armed vigilante patrols, which again I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, the fourth category of activity was engagement with law enforcement between far-right actors and police and sheriff's departments that were patrolling the local scenes around the protests. And in a limited number of cases, we identified what we believe to be signs of actual far-right infiltration in said departments. Next slide, please. So just to quickly go through this in terms of the violence that's been ideologically motivated violence that's been associated with the recent far-right mobilization. Just four quick examples. One, on May 29th, a pair of anti-government extremists who had expressed rhetoric that's affiliated with the Boogaloo anti-government movement, engaged in a shooting attack against a federal facility in Oakland, California, killing one security guard and wounding another. On May 30th, there were three anti-government extremists that were arrested for attempting to instigate violence: Stephen Parshall, William Loomis, and Andrew Lynham. On June 6th, one of the two individuals involved in the May 29th shooting, Stephen Carrillo, was also engaged in another shooting, ideologically motivated shooting attack against law enforcement, killing one officer and wounding another. After the suspect was apprehended, they also found him not only in possession of firearms, but also in illicit possession of explosives as well. And then finally, on June 7th in Henrico, Virginia, just outside of the state capital, Richmond, Virginia, a self-declared leader of a statewide Ku Klux Klan organization, the man named Harry Rogers, had engaged in a vehicle ramming attack, wounding several individuals who were involved in a protest at that site. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So just quickly about the sort of the top line findings that were there regarding presence in and around anti-racism protests. Again, we're looking at this from May 26th to June 20th. Our research design was the same for far left and far right. For the far right, we identified presence at 134 unique events across 36 US states and the District of Columbia. We had also, at 75 of those unique events, we had identified anti-government extremists present, whether they were militia, groups of militias, 3%ers, or Boogaloo movement. We identified a variety of white supremacists at 23 unique events. And then for what we termed the general far right and far right other, 21 unique events and 15 unique events respectively. Now, for those who might be human calculators and sort of trying to do the numbers quickly in their heads, if they don't add up to 134 unique events, you did calculate that correctly. The same thing also for the 42 far left events as well that Daryl had described earlier. The reason for that was that in a number of different cases, we actually found where there were more than one ideologically motivated type of actor present that were there. So for example, the category general far right, we define that as one of three different ways. So it can be an individual who expresses more than one ideology associated with the far right, say anti-government extremism or anti-immigrant hate. That was exactly the case, for instance, with one particular individual that we had ID'd as a counter-protester in Salt Lake City on May 30th. A second way that we define general far right is a group that expresses more support for more than one ideology at the same time. So, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center, when it does its annual hate group count, has a category called general hate. And one of the groups that is frequently listed on there, to use an example that's relevant to our category of general far right, is the Proud Boys. They are often engaged in extreme misogyny, in anti-Muslim prejudice, anti-immigrant xenophobia, and in many cases also often traffic in anti-Semitic and white supremacist memes and rhetoric. And so, for instance, whenever we identified Proud Boys present at an actor of a sort of similar ilk, then we categorize them under far right. And then finally, there just might be cases where there are groups that, there might be more than one group representing more than one ideology. So there are cases where there might have been militia extremists and white supremacists present, to use an example that was there. So that's why the numbers don't necessarily add up to 134, but when we parse out the numbers and very carefully analyze it, that's essentially how a lot of this broke down. The other thing I want to just briefly focus on here is the far right other, and that ties into the disinformation. So can we go to the next slide here? So really quickly, this is just sort of a graphic overview of the far right presence that's there. Again, 134 unique events, 36 US states, plus the District of Columbia. And this is just sort of a visual here to take a look at what this looks like. I will also say very, very quickly, our limitations that I mentioned in our data set notwithstanding, keep in mind that these are the numbers amid thousands of protests, thousands of unique events that have taken place during this time as well, though. So I want to more broadly contextualize the socio-political environment in which we're trying to interpret this data as well. Next slide, please. So, that fourth and final category of far right other, and this gets to the heart of the disinformation efforts that are there. As I mentioned earlier, there were, during this time period, social media rumors that spread virally about alleged plots by Antifa and Black Lives Matter to come to a lot of rural and suburban communities and engage in some sort of rioting. And what's interesting is that the rumors themselves, in many ways, are very closely track and fit into the broader narrative of a civil war that's espoused by many anti-government extremists. And so it's not surprising then that that in reaction to these social media rumors, not only were there vigilante groups that that were set up by local communities at a moment's notice, armed vigilante groups, but in many cases they were also working in conjunction with and aided by militia and other anti-extremist groups present there as well. Insofar as the disinformation efforts are concerned, there's still no publicly available evidence to suggest a foreign actor, at least at this time. What we do know, at least, is that there was at least one Twitter account that was identified as at least partly responsible for spreading rumors. This account is associated with the identitarian subsection of white nationalism or white supremacy. The group formerly known as Identity Europa, currently known as the American Identity Movement. They put out a statement shortly after this identification was revealed, denying responsibility for this. They claimed that it was some random troll instead. But again, Twitter nevertheless has stood by and said that the group formerly known as Identity Europa was responsible for it. And insofar as the social media platforms that were spread across, they include Facebook, Twitter, Nextdoor as well, which is one that's associated with a lot of local community homeowners and community groups. And one other, important thing to note here is that the rumors themselves were also spread and enabled by many local local officials, including some law enforcement officers as well. And this will be something, in terms of the relationship between far-right actors and law enforcement that we're going to touch upon again in just a few moments here. Next slide. And so on that then is looking at far-right and law enforcement. Just as before getting into our data on this, just a quick thing to keep in mind is that the far-right has had a long history of attempting to recruit to first responders. So that includes law enforcement, but that it can also include firefighters and any of the military services that are there. And while much attention has been paid to white supremacist attempts at recruitment and infiltration into first responder entities, anti-government groups are also extremely active in this regard. In fact, there are two high-profile anti-government groups that are dedicated exactly to doing this very thing: the Oath Keepers, who recruit heavily from first responders, and then the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is basically the group that represents an important subset of the larger anti-government extremist movement, who call themselves constitutional sheriffs. And what basically binds them is that these are elected county sheriffs who claim that they have the legal authority to disregard or even legally nullify any set of laws that they deem to be "quote unquote" unconstitutional in their view. So there's been a lot of history of far right attempts to recruit and infiltrate from first responder and especially law enforcement entities. In our data, we identified at least 10 cases of law enforcement linkages to far-right actors. 9 of these were anti-government extremists. The 10th involved what I call the anti-Antifa vigilante. So again, those armed vigilante groups that sprung up in reaction to the social media rumors that I mentioned before. That was our 10th case. And the 4 linkages that we've identified. Next slide, please. You can see up here on the slide, but basically we identified infiltration, or what we believe to be infiltration, in 4 different cases. Partnership and cooperation or coordination with local law enforcement. We identified that in 3 cases. There were also 2 cases where we saw law enforcement officers who engaged in photo ops with self-identified militia extremists that were there. And then finally, in 1 case, this was the 10th case involving the vigilantes, where a local law enforcement officer in Salem, Oregon, had actually provided an information tip-off to the vigilantes that were there, telling them how to avoid police and other protesters, and for the purposes of avoiding arrests, even though those individuals were actually armed. Their stated purpose was to apparently guard a business against a possible threat of looting from supposedly from Antifa or BLM. So I'll hand it back over to Daryl now to finish us out.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to try to run through these last 2 slides quickly so we can have time for questions. So I think this is one of the most important parts of the brief, is giving our forecast. Next slide, please. So the ongoing civil unrest and the ongoing pandemic will continue to provide extremists on both the far left and far right with recruitment and radicalization opportunities, and some of these people will mobilize towards violence. For anti-government groups as well as white supremacists, these BLM protests and the associated civil disturbance like the looting, rioting, property destruction serves as radicalization nodes that reinforce this notion of a coming civil war or societal collapse. Physical confrontations, street fights, shootings between protesters and counter-protesters are becoming more frequent at these BLM, as well as the new Back the Blue rallies. Just within the past 10 days, we've seen arrests made for these street fights and shootings at Stone Mountain, Georgia, Gilbert, Arizona, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Kenosha, Wisconsin, Fort Collins, Colorado, Portland and Gresham, Oregon, as well as Seattle, Washington. The recent storming of the Idaho State Building that we saw by Ammon Bundy and some of the militia members, as well as the storming of the Michigan State Capitol during the anti-lockdown protests, are very concerning and could be kind of a dry run for future stormings of other state capitals. So with these shootings that are starting to happen and continue to happen at these protests, we're starting to see the far left now counter-mobilizing and rearming itself to protect itself against these far-right vigilantes and militia groups that are coming armed. So one example of that is the Black militia group, Not Effing Around Coalition, that recently formed, that appeared in Stone Mountain as well as Louisville. We could see more of this to come. I noticed in some of the footage from the Kenosha shooting earlier this week that there were protesters with handguns that were drawn when that shooting was happening. Extremists on both sides, far left and far right, arming and mobilizing could lead to an increased risk of escalated violence. Lastly, on the forecast, the upcoming 2020 presidential election, the heated political rhetoric that we see surrounding that election, calling Antifa, domestic terrorists, using heavy-handed tactics, against protesters, possibly shifting racial overtones among these anti-government groups is another thing. So they're becoming increasingly more bigoted, talking about white people are under attack. They use code words, as Alejandro alluded to talk about the different races. And of course, these anti-government groups have always been anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim. So that makes them hate-oriented for those reasons. questioning the legitimacy of the upcoming election, rumors of voter fraud, the U.S. Postal Service's inability to process and deliver mail in a timely manner, voter mail-in ballots not being delivered. This is going to be contributing factors in agitating both sides. And so we believe that this current unrest that we're in, as well as violence that we're seeing, is going to continue for a few months up to the election and even in the immediate aftermath of the election. And some of this due to lawsuits being filed by the political parties, a slower vote count coming in because of the pandemic. This could bleed into early next year as well. Next slide. So I'm just going to mention the 4 things. You can go into the report and read the details of it, but our 4 recommendations are: there needs to be greater care among national leaders with their political rhetoric. Stop demonizing your opponents and dehumanizing them. There needs to be structural policing reforms, including fixes to fusion centers. Remove extremists from within the ranks of law enforcement. These people have no business conducting policing activities out on the street when your trust is being questioned by many communities. This only erodes that trust. And then lastly, give greater priority to combating far-right violence. I've been saying this for 10 years. I've seen the Justice Department and the FBI taking preliminary steps to start doing just that, but we need an all-hands approach to this. Legislators, federal, state, and local authorities, the media, everybody on board. And that concludes the briefing. So I think we're going to turn the time over to Aaron and do some Q&A.
Thank you, Daryl.
Thank you so much, you guys. Everyone, as a reminder, you're welcome to drop any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A box, and I will be sure to moderate them. In the meantime, I actually have a few questions. I was surprised when you mentioned Nextdoor as one of the platforms that is used to kind of spread disinformation, things like that. Is this related to kind of local grassroots movements, or do you think this is kind of a result of extremists being kicked out off of the larger platforms like Twitter and Facebook? Or what do you think might be the reason behind their use of things like Nextdoor?
Daryl, do you want to take this, or?
I was going to ask you.
Okay, sure. So, I mean,
alluded to it. I mean, they're getting kicked off of other social platforms, and so they're migrating to other ways to get their information out. Listservs and email mailing lists have historically been ways, even fax networks back when faxing was a thing. So, they'll use whatever latest technology there is to get the message and circulate the information out.
Exactly. I think it's both opportunism and also I think just the fact that they're wherever there's an open platform for them to spread their message, they'll do it. It's as simple as that. So it's a combination of displacement effects, but again, just the fact that they want to get their message out there as much as they can.
Sure. And then I was also, I'm interested in the recruiting by anti-government organizations of law enforcement and first responders, which seems counterintuitive, right? That's not what we would kind of expect of an anti-government group to reach out to actual government workers in an attempt to infiltrate them. Can you kind of go into more detail about that and what you think is behind that?
Daryl, can you take that for a moment?
Sure. So basically they target law enforcement officers because they're symbols of authority and usually involved in enforcement of our laws. But also they want to target these individuals not only because they have access to sensitive information that they could share with the extremist group, because you got to remember a lot of these militias are into preparing for a societal collapse or a civil war. So they want to know about targets in their community and how they're physically protected in order for planning and plotting purposes, but also leadership skills among some of the law enforcement and just, trying to bring these people just like they do the military, bring their skill sets, bring their intelligence, bring their access to sensitive information to try to boost their capabilities.
Let me also just add to that. So as Daryl articulated, there's a very, very important functional component to it that's there. There's also an ideological component to this in the sense that one thing to sort of step back and look at this in terms of history is that the contemporary anti-government extremist movement itself, in many respects, traces a lot of its origins to a form of white supremacy known as Christian identity movement. And in the 70s, there was a movement called the Posse Comitatus that essentially mixed anti-government sentiment and white supremacy together. And among other things about its ideology is that it espoused these bizarre pseudo-legal theories that one could call county supremacy. And basically the idea that the county itself is probably the most important sort of like highest level of constitutional government that's around. And among the county, it's the county sheriff who's probably the highest level of elected official that they believe to be constitutional. Now, the reason for this bizarre pseudo-legal, theorizing is in part because this was just a strategy to justify continued segregation between whites and non-whites. But over time, as the anti-government movement evolved and basically jettisoned a lot of its overt bigotry, it still kept, though, important aspects of its original ideology. And so in some ways, this is where the constitutional sheriffs also comes in. This is why you see a lot of recruitment as well. So that in addition to this very, very practical, very functional set of purposes that Daryl mentioned, there's also some deeply historical and ideological reasons behind it as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will note it is about 2 o'clock. I don't mind. You guys are able to stick around a bit longer to answer some questions, right? Okay, great. For everyone else, it's okay if you have to duck out. The recording of this event will be available on our website by the end of the day. But we'll keep going for a couple more minutes to answer a few more questions. One person was asking, do you have any examples from non-US protests? Have you been able to study any other regions, such as European countries, where far-right and far-left extremism is also very active?
The limitation of our data is confined to the US.
Sure, thank you. One question, have you noticed significant cross-pollination between the far-right groups you've studied and QAnon? Is there any evidence so far of any kind of coordination?
Daryl?
I mean, the QAnon conspiracy theory really resonates with the far right. And so, we have all kinds of conspiracy theories out there historically that have brought people into these respective movements. And so QAnon is just the latest of these. And I think it's particularly dangerous because it kind of melds together a lot of past conspiracies into this brand new one and puts kind of a fresh spin on things and really attempts to demonize the Democratic Party in particular by making these false allegations of, human trafficking, child sex rings, pedophilia, things of this nature. And it was recently named by the FBI as a domestic terrorism threat.
Thank you. So I have another question. You touched on the use of ambiguous or intentionally misleading clothes or disguises to confuse or mislead or misrepresent those who are engaging in violence. For example, people who are disguised as Antifa or Black Bloc, Boogaloo, or even undercover law enforcement. Can you elaborate on the prevalence of that? If it's very frequent or very rare, and how concerning is this for researchers and others who are trying to understand these events?
I think it's a growing phenomena, and you see it particularly with the armed vigilantes. It's becoming increasingly more difficult to separate those who respond to a militia call for action, like we saw up in Kenosha, with the 17-year-old showing up, no known ties to any of those militia groups that were participating, yet he was hanging out with them and, conducting the protection of a business alongside them. So it's happening more frequently, and we see it on both sides, and it does make detection and analysis more difficult because of that.
Sure, thank you. In one of your notes on the slides toward the end, you mentioned quality control issues with fusion center fusion center generated information. Can you kind of go into more detail about that?
Sure. So one of the things, when looking at the disinformation as well, is that much of the the pathway towards how it was spread and enabled was also because you had law enforcement entities that were reading and generating reports that essentially repeated uncritically these rumors that were taking place. And so, in addition to actors who were inside the fusion centers, you then had other law enforcement consumers outside of it who were trying to get information. And so this has been sort of a long-standing issue with fusion centers more broadly, has been that there's been a lot of debate and controversy about their value added since they were established post 9/11. What's the quality of the information? Is the intelligence that they and information that they generate useful to and accurate to the consumer that's there? And so this is one of the reasons why I sort of bring this up, is because those same quality control issues that have been around for a number of other issues, if you will, or activities came to light as well when it came to these social media rumors. And unfortunately, in many ways, because there were people who said, "Oh, I got this from a fusion center," it added a certain level of gravitas and legitimacy to otherwise baseless rumors.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for questions right now. We only went a couple of minutes over time, so that's good. But guys, thank you so much for being with us today and speaking with us today. This was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And everyone, if you like this event, you're welcome to go to our events page and sign up for one of our upcoming events. Thank you again for being with us today, and everyone having a wonderful day.